live on LinkedIn. I'll just wait to get some confirmation of that, and then we'll give people a couple of minutes, and then we'll make a start.
Okay.
If that's okay. Just stick myself on mute. Great stuff. I'm just getting the technical confirmation that all is in order from the team. So we'll just give everyone else an opportunity, and then we'll make a start. Quick glug of tea.
Coffee for us Americans.
It's all good. It's all good. All right, just give me 30 seconds and we'll make a start. Sorry, I managed to lose my notes there for a second. So, okay, let's make a start. Hello and welcome again to another episode of For the Journey, our number 4 now we're up to with this our podcast and live stream, where we're talking to IP Fabric's partners and customers about how they're faring up, I suppose, on the road to the self-driving network. That network automation seems to drive us all these days. Today's guest needs no real introduction. If you've been following IP Fabric's journey this year, it's kind of interwoven, in particular, with today's guest. Rich, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Well, thank you very much, Daren. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on and allowing me to talk with you about automation, Federating Sources of Truth, and all that. My name is Rich Martin. I'm the Senior Technical Marketing Engineer at Itential, which means when I'm not demoing and doing webinars, I'm having conversations like this with partners, with prospects, with customers, and with our own teams to continue. And I love this for the journey because we always see this as an automation journey. And so what we do at Itential is we have a software platform that enables networking teams to build network automations because that's always the starting point. And quite honestly, and you know this, the network domain needs more automation probably
Always.
compared to a lot of the other technical domains in IT. So that's really our starting point. But our view of automation really goes beyond that. But we got to start somewhere, right? It's about meeting them where they're at, right? At that particular time.
No, that's a great point. I mean, you hear all this about network automation all the time at the moment. Obviously, it's a big buzz phrase. It's a thing that people are engaged with, and it's captured the imagination. But it can only ever tell part of the story, isn't it? And so I guess that's where we have the commonality, isn't it? It's about being able to say, this is part of the story. This is only part of what we're trying to achieve through automation. It's really about improving operations more generally, I suppose, and automating not just the network itself, but other aspects as well.
Absolutely. And that is a huge part of what we do is we have to meet the customer where they're at. And a lot of times they're focused on their automation strategy, where they're at in their journey is focused on where it hurts the most, right? Yeah. So if we're talking to a networking team, they're looking at the backlog of changes, probably in the data center, but it could be all over the network. And it's like, well, what can I do to automate all of these steps that that I have to go through in order to make a change, right? Especially if it's CLI, right? Lots and lots of CLI changes. That's a starting point. But really, you have to widen that and broaden that out. And so, and that's walking them through that journey, right? Where does that data come from? So before you make a network change, that data has to come from somewhere, and it's probably multiple somewheres, right?
Right.
And so what we do is we want to meet them where they're at. Certainly do the network automation piece of it, but kind of broaden out that view of automation, because it is about automating the process,
Sure.
the whole operation, the end-to-end process. And with that, part of our platform is the ability to integrate with all of those different systems, both network, sources of truth, IT systems, ticketing systems, all of that, so that when they're ready in that journey to start broadening out, right? And there's always different phases. Let's start with the network change. Now let's gather some data. Let's do things like update tickets, in ServiceNow or Jira or whatever it may be. And moving forward, building automations that are robust and intelligent that can actually do like post-check, pre-check, post-check processes. And as we're going to talk about today, not only just generating data from different sources of truth, probably, right? But also ensuring before and after those changes that operationally everything is in line.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what do you do when it's not in line, right?
Yeah. All fantastic points. And I suppose comes back to that thing, doesn't it? Everyone says the first thing you do in when you're building automation is have a source of truth. But you've already alluded to the fact that actually a source of truth might be a step too far, right? We've all got systems already that we use operationally. We all have, as we're doing our network operations, we have our CMDBs, we have our ticketing systems, and all of these things that have data that's useful to create automation, I suppose. So is it sensible then to try and use one source of truth, or what's your thinking on that?
Well, I think we think very pragmatically. Having a single source of truth, it's kind of like this cycle that we've been going through. So if we go back in time in our time machines to the early days of, and I'm going to use this bad word, SDN, right? Because it promised, and I worked at another vendor where we had open flow in our hardware. Right. We had a hardware switch. We had open flow. We used something called Open Daylight as a controller. And the promise was one controller to rule all of your networking, which is awesome, because then I have a single brain that I can go to that knows about the configuration and the state of the whole network, right? Well, what happened? It didn't really pan out quite that way. There's a lot of challenges with scalability.
Yeah.
Some networks are completely different than other networks,
right?
And they can't be modeled the same way. And even look at today, right? If your network is now partially in the cloud, right? Network teams doing cloud networking, that's completely different than anything we've ever experienced.
But you can say that about pretty much any network now, right? Because
nowadays,
I think you're absolutely right. There was that whole. I mean, look, you and I, we've been around a little while, right? Well, certainly I have. I'm speaking for myself now, rather than you as well.
I think I've already given myself away on that.
Yeah. But we've seen networks develop from a single piece of wire in an office connecting, a bunch of PCs in a server, to a situation where all of a sudden you need a dozen servers rather than one. So you have a data center. Then you need a wide area network to connect all your multiple offices to that data center. Then you need, and so on and so on. And we've just exponential growth of the use of IT has meant that we've just introduced complexity on complexity on complexity, right?
Correct.
As a result, I suppose that's where the problems start to occur with trying to bring a single view of everything together. Now, I'm not talking myself out of this, because IP Fabric, it does have that ability to give you a single operational view of what's going on, but that's not what we're talking about at this stage. What we need to understand is that you've got multiple systems controlling certain parts of the network.
Correct.
And those are going to have the data that you need in order to deliver change and whatever into that network. Right?
Absolutely. And so from that, the original root of the idea of controllers, we've seen the implementation in smaller domains, right? So if we look at SD-WAN, like you mentioned, there's a controller there. If we look at, wireless, Wi-Fi network, enterprise Wi-Fi, there's controllers there. Even in the data center, you're deploying controllers. So these kind of controllers help to understand and integrate with both, so as a source of truth, but also as a way to help with the automation process, right? But really and truly, we're also seeing a lot of great tools, utilities, systems that help network teams create their own databases that are very specific to their types of network, right? Netbox being a great example of that, right?
I was going to say
a lot of our customers start off with like IP address management, because that's kind of the top of mind thing. Like, we always need IP addresses, we always need to assign them. We need to step away from the spreadsheets. We need a place to manage them in one place. And this is a great tool. But the other side of that tool is, while they have a lot of data center infrastructure management, it's very flexible.
Yeah.
You can go, you can define data center, this row, this rack, this switch, this port, this VLAN, this VXLAN configuration needs to talk to this server, right? Going all the way down to that layer, which now gives an amazing source of truth.
To the cables themselves,
down to the cabling itself, right?
Yeah.
So the trick is, if network automation for a lot of folks, especially on the networking, starts with making network changes, we want to help them understand, well, your network changes has to have data. So in order to make a change on all of these controllers and things like that, or even directly to a device on, via CLI, you have to have that data. That data has to come from somewhere. So how do we integrate those systems, grab that data, automate that piece of it, and now take you to that step where you can validate the change, make the change, and then make sure, and this is the critical piece too, right? Make sure that the change does the thing we wanted it to do, we intended it to do, right? And that's where we're talking about the state of the network, the actual operational state.
And I think it's important to make that distinction, right? Because ultimately you have this intended state, right? This data that's stored wherever it's stored, like you say, could be any number of systems or all in one. It almost doesn't matter, but be able to gather that information to deploy based on that, and then look to the network itself to turn around and say, well, actually, do these match? Are these something that has the intent? I see we use the word intent so much, but is the outcome of the change, does it match what the intent was for that change? Right. That's for me is the thing. And it's interesting because any one change, of course, has multiple tasks within that change, and each task has its own outcome, but there's an outcome of the overarching change as well, right? So you might pull data from different places for different parts of the change. Let's say you're making a change to add a new service into the network. What you may decide is, I want a port standing up on a particular VLAN with a particular IP address for a server to be attached to. I might want to change a firewall rule so that server is able to access the auxiliary services it needs, and that users on another subnet somewhere else are able to access that service, and so on. And so you're going to have different management domains for each of those things, potentially with different data sources for the data that you need to bring that together. So it's this idea, I guess, of collecting the intended state data from multiple places, manipulating them so that they are in the right form to then deploy the change.
Right.
So it's APIs, data transformation, all of that good stuff going on, the playing out into the change, and then the magic when you're coming back to verify not just that the individual tasks are successful, but the overall outcome is as well, right?
Correct. And that hits upon broadening that view of what automation really is. It includes all those systems, because what's triggering a lot of these changes, right? Somebody's opening a change request ticket, right, in an enterprise, and saying, I need this new service, or I need to deploy this new application, or I need to connect my my remote branch to this application. That involves lots of changes across lots of parts of the network, right?
Yeah.
And so having a view of just making a change in one part of the network doesn't get the job done.
Yeah.
You got to do multiple changes. And here's the key. When all those changes are done, if the application is not, you can't connect to the application, let's say from the remote office, if that was the request, the end user says it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether or not it was a network problem, a firewall problem, a routing problem, if it doesn't work, then you spent all that time and you didn't accomplish that task, right? So we should be looking at that great overall. What are all the changes required, right? And now all of these domains. What are the sources of data? How do we transform that data to inflict those changes on these different network domains? It might be a control. It could be in the cloud, could be an SD-WAN controller for your remote office, could be, CLI changes in your data center, leaf spine switches. All of those things have to be done. And then at the culmination is, does it work?
Yeah.
Does it work?
And that, of course, I mean, hey, we'll blow the trumpet at this point, because that is, of course, where IP Fabric steps in and plays a huge part, right? Because we have that visibility across the entire network, so we're able to gather that and model that view to validate the outcome as being, right, this application is able to be accessed from this location, and everything in the network allows it to. And if it doesn't, if it fails at any stage, we can identify the point at which it's going to fail, and so send triggers back into the automation process to go fix the issue. And if anyone wants to see this in action, we had great fun setting up a demo, right, for the Tech Field Day at Cisco Live back in June, where there's a really neat demo there. Even though I say so myself, I thought it was pretty cool.
It also hits upon all of these things we've been talking about.
But I think that's the important point here, right? Is this isn't about blowing a trumpet. This is about explaining a problem, because once you've executed that and the state of your network has changed, you've then got to think about the sources of truth, and do they accurately then reflect what the network looks like at a point in time? Because yes, you've done the change, yes, it's been successful, but there may be changes in the state of the network that aren't necessarily then reflected back into those sources of truth, right? So then it becomes a decision point. What do I do with this assurance data from the network to make sure that everyone has that consistent view of what the network looks like at that point in time? Decision time.
So here's a situation that every network engineer could probably relate to. That's kind of the smaller scale version of what we're talking about. I'm about to manually provision, an IP address on a port, right? I go to the port. It ought to be nothing on it. There should be nothing on it. I'm told this is the next port I can use, and there should be nothing on it. But I get on the configuration, I get on the switch or the router, I look at the port, I look at the configuration. There's something on it. What do I do now? Right? The link is active and it's actively passing data. What do I do now? I have a conflict, right?
Yeah.
I was told this is the port where we're connecting up to this new customer service or server or whatever it may be. I have the data that I need, but something in the actual state is different. So now I have to go back and figure out what to do. Do we define a new port? Is that an old system or service that we can overwrite and reuse, right? Those things have to be done. As network engineers, we've run into these problems, the unexpected, right? And this is, I think, a critical insight, because when folks look at network automation, they're looking at, how do I automate all these changes on the network, reduce backlog, things like that. But now you have the tools with automation, with sources of truth, and with understanding the operational state of the network, all integrated together to now build automations that help identify these conflicts, drifts, and intelligently do something about it. And that intelligence comes from the networking team, the engineers, right? So for us, it's about, okay, we know this is going to happen. This is a challenge that's always going to happen. Why? People.
Right.
People
exactly.
make changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all know at 3 a.m, sometimes you make a change. You have to make a change because sometimes the state of the network is, hey, we got to get it up.
Yeah.
Right. And if that change is now not reinstituted and updated somewhere in your source of truth.
And I think that's an interesting point in itself, right? Because here, what you're talking about is really, and I don't want to boil it down to the D word, but it's documentation to some extent, right? That's what we're talking about here, because that source of truth really should represent the future state documentation of the network. And if that's incorrect for any reason, if you have to have manual responsibility for keeping that documentation up to date, it has a knock on the quality of your automation, right? Because if you've got to rely on the fact, you've got to trust the fact that documentation is kept up to date, and ultimately that's what a source of truth is, right? It's a documented state. So if your process for updating it is manual, then you run into exactly this particular problem, right? So I guess what we're talking about is, as part of your automation workflow, what you need to be able to do is lift the resulting state data out of the network and ensure that the intended state matches that actual state, that observed state, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's, and everybody loves good documentation when you're on the side that needs documentation, right? The receiving side, but actually making the documentation is tedious. That's why so much documentation is not updated. It's not done. It's an extra step. It's a replication of data and work that you've already done. So with automation, building those things, and again, that's part of the broadening out of the understanding of what automation is for network teams and all teams in IT, is we should have steps that integrate with that document, that source of truth, or that ticketing system, to be able to automatically document that. Because here's the thing: if I'm pulling information from a source of truth in regards to how a particular service needs to be provisioned, IP addresses, ports, things like that, VLANs, whatever it may be, if I already have that in the automation, it's just another step to transform that data, update the ticket, update the source of truth, at a particular step in the automation, and boom. And now documentation is not tedious, it's up to date. And I would argue, if organizations are going towards a single source of truth as their overall strategy, that's going to be even a bigger challenge to keep that up to date. So you're going to have to rely more heavily on automation to be able to do all those updates and keep that information is in sync as possible.
And fundamentally, from Itential's perspective, we're talking about getting access to that data over API, right? Because that's the key to being able to put this together into a workflow. You're able to access that observed state as well as the intended state over API, and you're able to compare data, do that work to say, here's where stuff's gone out of date. And in some circumstances, absolutely, all you'll do is just go back and update that intended state, right? That source of truth. In other circumstances, you might look and say, actually, it looks like we might have to do some more automation to fix this particular state, because the sync is the wrong way. So we need to go back and go again. And in some cases, it's going to need manual intervention, and you can't really do anything but decide, right, that data, I can't just dump it straight into the source of truth, because it needs someone to look at it and to be sure what's going on here.
Absolutely.
But of course, the beauty there is, because of the way Itential works, and because your ticketing system is connected to the workflow, you just update the ticketing status, right? To go and allocate it to someone who can go and do that manual check. And then when they've done the manual check, update the ticket, and it automatically then goes and processes that update in whichever way it needs to.
Yeah, absolutely. You've hit upon all of those things. So the API integration within Itential, making it easy, making it quick, literally being able to take, an open API spec from a system which publicly, published, and dragging and dropping it into our platform and generating essentially an integration or an adapter for accessing those systems, opens up all of those possibilities. So it's not just even reading data from, a source of truth, but it's also writing data to a source of truth. It's also creating new tickets. It's updating those tickets. It's, and so now, like you said, like, automation still requires the intelligence and the expertise of the network team. What we need to do is allow them to build automations quickly and efficiently to express all of that intelligence. And then it becomes an iterative process, right? Because now I run into these changes or these conflicts between intended state, source of truth, and what the actual state is. And We run into these things. Oh, okay, we know how to handle that. Let's build that intelligence into the workflow.
It's interesting what you say about the iterative thing there, because that got me thinking. I suppose for automation to be fully successful, every step of the automation needs an automated task, right? You need to be able to carry that out in a way where you're piecing together automation tasks in order to deliver a complete workflow. But there's nothing stopping you, when you have the right approach, to having manual steps in there, so long as you're able to then re-trigger the continuation of the workflow. So you could almost build the process out, and even if one of the steps might require a manual intervention, ultimately you can get to a point where you've perhaps run through it a couple of times and realize actually that step can be automated.
Correct.
You could just then drop it into the place in the workflow, right?
Yep. Yeah. And I always think back to the manual process as as a network engineer on a network team. As soon as you identify like how to fix certain problems, I'm also communicating it with the rest of my team. Like, we've run into that, and this is how you fix that. Automations for networking teams should be the same kind of iterative process.
Right.
We figured out how to fix that. Let's check to see if that's the source of the issue. If that's going to, and you basically are detailing that process in your automation.
Yeah.
It's just so having the systems and then making it easy for networking engineers to be able to do that in a low code, no code environment.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. I think you've hit on something really interesting there, and I think hopefully give people food for thought. That idea of having to validate the data that's going to and fro, because it's key to the whole process, isn't it? Without good data, you're going to get a rubbish automation. So
we always say you need the best data in order, as a piece of having reliable, robust automation. Like, you would never automate on stale old data. Like, that would probably not end up in a successful automation result.
No, and I suspect that's what a lot of people struggle with, right? Is again, if your source of truth in the first place isn't in good state, that it doesn't accurately reflect what you want the network to be, but B, what the network has been previously, you're going to really struggle to deliver anything meaningful.
Correct. And you'll always be very limited in your ability to automate, and it starts to become more like a patchwork of automation with humans, pushing buttons behind the scenes. I can, I feel safe automating this little tiny task.
Yeah.
But then when that's done, I have to take the output of that because,
or someone's got to actually sit there and press the button to run the automation in the first place.
Right. Exactly. No, and so that is a very limiting thing in automation. You shouldn't have to do that. That's not what it's about. So that's why it's important to have that broader view, to be able to integrate with these systems, to use that data and manipulate it, and then leverage the data anywhere you can. As you don't have to do everything at once, but I'll tell you, as soon as we talk to prospective customers about how we accomplish making network changes, gathering data, the very next thing is like, hey, wait a minute, I spent a lot of time in ServiceNow. What can you do there? And now their minds are widened up, right? Yeah.
For me, and this is because that's very much the space that we have in the conversations with customers as well, right? Is that there's so much data in the platform, and it's in such a strongly structured form that means that there's so many things and so many people, different groups of teams, right? So it doesn't have to be the network team. It can be the security team. It can be the server infrastructure team. It can be the cloud team, as you've alluded to already. All of these folk need access to that data. And so if we can make that data available to them in as simple a form as possible, by bringing it together and combining it from whichever sources, then it's all good, right?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah, and then it's like being able to make your automations more efficient. There's a couple of things there too. It's like once network teams understand that they can build in these very intelligent, robust automations that integrate sources of truth, data, can speak to systems like IP Fabric to understand network state and validate that yes, this is working. Then it's like publishing those automations for self-service catalogs, or maybe the DevOps team is doing some CI/CD, and now they can build automations and participate in what the rest of is the rest of the IT organization is doing in publishing those automations.
And I guess as well, making those the outputs from those clear as well, right? By put them into I don't know, chat rooms
Oh, sure.
and those sorts of things, and sending emails and that kind of stuff. But but publishing out the results of those automations as well.
Yes, correct. Yeah. Well, I can tell you.
I was going to say that sounds like a whole nother story.
There's a whole
there.
other thing, but it's such an important thing, having communications between teams,
Sure.
especially like with network operations teams, right? Those guys are tasked with making sure the network's running, and if you're about to do some work on the network, how often, I'm guilty, I'm going to use myself as the example, but as the scapegoat here, but how often at 3 a.m. things aren't going quite well, or you've got so much work to do. I didn't tell the network operations team I'm about to start, right? They should already know, right? They should already know.
Yeah.
But if I can actually tell them I'm starting and here's specifically what I'm doing, when I'm doing it, and how I'm doing it, that communication, it makes, everything run more efficiently. And maybe, it helps them to understand subsequent impact on the network.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
So they can handle that. They can front end any calls that happen. Right. They don't bother you about it. It makes everything more efficient. So even something
event
small
correlation
like Slack,
and all that stuff, right?
is a big efficient, and it's all about efficiency.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the other thing too, is it's really interesting to see how our customers get very clever and make things more efficient.
Yeah.
In their automation. And something like IP Fabric, I'll tell you what, here's something that comes up all the time, and it's such a simple thing. How do I find a MAC address on my network?
Yeah.
Well, if you're going to do it manually, right? Or even in an automated way, I have to look at I have to look at all the MAC address tables on my switches. That's one way to do
it. You start logging in and you start crawling that network, because that's the only way you're going to do it.
Is there a way to make that more efficient?
I know one.
Yeah, exactly. So it's also looking at ways of being more efficient. And when you can become, when you can start tweaking your automations to become more efficient, over time, again, that's more of a, let's get an automation done. And now let's,
using whatever data sources are available. Again, right? It's that thing of going, because, and I appreciate we're blowing the time here, but
this what happens when we start talking.
Yeah, that's true. I was thinking, you mentioned SDN controllers and stuff before, but you could even regard those as sources of truth.
Of course,
right?
Because,
Because of what they do is represent what you want to deliver in a part of the network, and it may be, instead of having a split of certain types of data in certain repositories, what you might have is the same type of data in multiple places, depending which part of the network you're talking about. Because of course, no network is one network. Everything is a network of networks, right?
Right.
And each domain of the network has its own management approach and its own processes. So yeah, and those controllers, they can be looked at as a source of truth, like for inventory, right? They're going to know, your SD-WAN controller is going to know which SD-WAN routers and devices are on the network. Why? Because it has to be provisioned through the controller in order for it to actually work. So, that's something we can access and even relate back to a database, right? If you want to go that route, and relate that and going back to automating and understanding the differences between the two. That's all good stuff. Rich, I have burned a lot of your time, and I don't plan on keeping you too much longer. I was just wondering if you've got any other any gems of knowledge that you might want to share with people before we stop.
Well, I think just kind of recapping what we've talked about. If you're on a networking team and you're looking at automation, you're probably looking at tools like Python or Ansible. Those seem to be the ones that always pop up. And there's a very big skills gap to learn how to do automation correctly in those environments. Take a look at Itential. We are custom built and engineered to allow networking teams to build automations exactly the way you want, to translate that information in your head into a canvas where you can start to automate across not just your CLI based network, but through a controller, cloud, wherever it may be, and integrate all these systems. And here's the cool thing. We understand that integration is a two-way street, right? So if you already have that, that really rare network engineer who also has picked up Ansible or has picked up Python and is writing, automation scripts, we can integrate that into the system. So it literally becomes another step in a task. And so you don't have to throw any of that away. And so it gives you the best of both worlds. And now not just that one person or maybe that couple of people on the team that know how to leverage those particular tools can do automation. It's really everybody on the team can now start to use automation and use the tools and the utilities and the programs they've already created. And that's why we say we want to meet, those networking teams where they're at, but then we want to progress them on that journey. Let's integrate all of those sources of truth. Let's make sure we build the right pre-checks and post-checks and include, systems and tools like IP Fabric that make that part of it much more efficient. Because again, at the end of the day, even every network engineer knows it's just got to work, right?
Yeah.
And so when a change request comes in, the end result is it's got to work. It's got to work the way we intended.
Perfect. Great way to close. Thank you very much for your time, Rich. And I love that you got all the buzzwords in that last segment. And no, it's awesome. It's really good.
Well, that's the technical marketing.
The technical marketing engineer, right there. No, it's all good.
Of my role, but yeah.
No, thank you for your time, mate. It's always good to talk, of course.
Always,
and
Daren, thank you very much.
We'll hopefully speak again soon. But
absolutely,
that's it for this episode. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.